Hello and welcome to my testimony. I'm here recording in my closet because I felt like it, and also I think that shirts hanging up and other clothing improves audio quality, maybe. So, guess we'll see about that. So, yeah, today I'm gonna be giving my whole testimony, beginning to end, all 21 years of my life, roughly summarized, and I'm going to be doing it through a lens that is a little different, and it's still going to make sense. So, a lot of my struggles and my relationship with God are characterized by several mental disorders that I've overcome throughout my life. And each of those disorders kind of corresponds to a different phase of my life, a different era, you could say. And yeah, each one has its own sort of defining moments which have shaped who I am today and what my relationship with God is today. And the first of those eras would be childhood, when I was afflicted with OCD, also known as obsessive compulsive disorder. So if you don't know what OCD is, essentially it's a disorder that forces your mind to do things that are compulsive. So you don't really have a justification for doing these things. You just do them out of compulsion. So, for instance, if I ever touched something with my left hand, I might feel the urge to then touch it with my right. Or if I'm walking on the sidewalk, I might want to touch each crack with my left and right foot equal times. Or maybe I'll just simply be counting my steps as I go. Or maybe I'll be doing like various different things. And in moderation, this isn't that bad, it's pretty harmless. But the way that it was for me, it was extreme. It was deeply, deeply affecting my life. So to the extent you look at me and you observe my behavior and you're like, what's going on? Like it had a foothold on my life. And well, I didn't really know it, but what I needed was God. So once it got to a bad point, once it started really affecting my behavior and my ability to just survive in the world, my parents decided that they needed to do something about it. And so they went out and hired a Christian psychologist, a child psychologist. And then they went with her and she talked, and that was a hugely beneficial experience. The way that she framed it was, she said, there's this commander in my mind and he's doing these things, he's giving me these orders, and I have the ability to say no. I just need to actually say no. So if I ever feel those compulsions, I need to audibly say no and then not do it. So that's kind of the practical stuff that she taught me. But then in addition to that, she also prayed with us every time we'd go. She did all this stuff. And then even in addition to that, my family set up a support group in our church. There were a few older ladies who were praying for me each week. And really, it's through this experience that I got my first exposure to God as someone who played an active role in my life. If you see me looking this direction, by the way, I'm looking at my notes. I have an outline that's going to help me make sure that I stay on track. So it was a really slow process. It took multiple months. And every time I'd go, she'd ask me, like, what percentage of your brain is being controlled by this commander? And right at the beginning, I said 90%. 90%. But over time, it went down and down and down until eventually it was 10%, and then 5%, and then 0%. eventually I was healed. Not completely healed. I still have OCD and I still get some compulsions, but I gained control of my mind. It was no longer the commander who was in charge, it was me. And I have no one to thank for that except God. My family did all this work and put in all this effort and all these people praying for me, and it worked. I gained control. And really, that's when I think I first realized that I needed God. This isn't just someone that, I can put aside like, oh, yeah, I believe in him, but I don't really do anything. No. He is a part of my life. And he does things for me. He has an impact in my life. And I learned a lot. I learned some self-control through that. And I also learned a very valuable verse, which is 2 Corinthians 10:5. So you capture every thought and make it surrender and obey Christ. That's exactly what I did. Yeah. That was great. So the next phase of my life, this would be teenagehood, was defined by a different mental disorder. And this one was ADD, or ADHD, as you might know it. Attention Deficit Disorder. ADD crippled my education. Not fully. I mean, if you wanted to sit me down and have me write up an essay or some other piece of creative writing, I could do it, and I could do it quite well. But if you wanted me to sit down and do simple math, or even, Lord forbid, solve a quadratic, I couldn't do it. Not one bit, Not at all. Out of the question. I with ADD as it was at that time, I was useless with math. And even now I'm not super great with it. But I needed to complete my education. So my parents once again stepped in and they gave me medication. And I don't blame them at all for this. I needed this medication. I agreed to take it as much as they offered it to me as an option. But this medication, it was very effective. It was very effective. So effective to the point that I was a year ahead in math. So I completed my diploma in grade 11. My diploma exam, that is. That's a Canadian thing in case you're not from Canada. It just means your big final exam. And I completed that in grade 11. And I got, I think, a 60 or 70%. Actually, I think it was 80%, now that I'm remembering. I did very well. And that's all well and good. But it came with a consequence. So the way that this particular medication worked is that it made you focus. Yes. I mean, very valuable if you have ADD. But it also took away your personality, like, completely. You wanted to talk to people, no chance. You can talk to people, but you have no personality. You're basically a walking drone. And that hurt. That really hurt my high school existence. I couldn't really make friends very easily. The entire first year, I didn't have any friends, and then the second year, there was like a group of people that I wanted to be friends with. But the entire time, I would just sit near them, but I would never actually go up and talk with them and, engage with them. And that's because I could barely talk with anyone because I had no personality. And during this time, and I think in part due to this reality, I developed a lot of deep anxiety and depression. And I experienced some depression in my childhood as well, but in this case it became very bad. And throughout this entire time, I grew up a Christian, a strong Christian, and I had no plans to depart from that, probably in part due to my experience with OCD. But mm, I I had never heard from God. I had never spoken or heard God speak to me. That is, I had spoken to God many, many times, but He never spoke back. I called again and again and again, like, Lord, will you reveal yourself to me? Will you show yourself so I can know you're real? And God was silent. He was completely silent. But there came a time, this would have been near the end of grade 11. Actually, I think it was in the summer between grade 11 and grade 12. I went to a summer camp. And there, I had this feeling going in, like, these summer camps, every time I went to one, it was always just a really great spiritual experience. I came out of it just feeling great. But this was the last time that I would be young enough to go to the summer camp. After this point, I'd be too old and I'd have to stop. I'd have to stop going permanently. So I went in knowing that this would be my final time. And in this time, God spoke to me for the first time. There was a moment where I felt the time had finally arrived, and I just went out in the woods and I cried. I cried very hard, and I asked, Lord, just please fill the cracks. Fill the cracks in my life, all this anxiety and depression and some sin too. Please just fill the broken cracks in me. And God answered. A feeling came over me that I cannot describe, an intense feeling. And for the very first time, I felt God's presence, like He was there with me. And I do not exaggerate when I say that every moment after that point, I have felt some sense of God being with me. And I'm always aware that He's there with me. And after that point, I didn't really have to worry about ADD anymore. I stopped taking the medication because I finished all the math stuff, and I graduated high school and then moved into my public relations program, which thankfully takes very little math. And, I've been able to adjust to that. I don't really need medication anymore. I can survive. It's kind of tough sometimes, but I can survive. But through this whole high school experience, what I learned from God is that He's my companion. He's there with me. He's there alongside me during my struggles. When I feel terrible, He's always there. He will never leave me. He will never forsake me. He's there. Now, the final phase of my life, the final era, would be the one post-graduation, moving into university. So, the disorder for this era of my life would be social anxiety disorder, which I didn't actually know I had until a few years ago, when one of my parents just casually mentioned, like, oh, by the way, you've had that ADD and OCD. You also have social anxiety disorder, by the way. They diagnosed you with that. Just a heads up. And I mean, I basically knew that, but I didn't know it was an actual disorder. But anyway, the main way that social anxiety has affected me in the last few years, until I would say this year, or maybe sometime near the end of last year, is that it's plummeted my self-confidence. Any social situation that I entered, I felt this deep anxiety, like I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't know how to hold a conversation. I didn't know how to develop relationships. And as a result, I had no self confidence. And the pandemic, when it first started and when it continued to go and when it continued to go for what felt like a decade, that only made things worse because I wasn't talking with people in person. I was talking with them over Zoom. And when I did talk with them in person, there was a mask over my face, so I felt like I wasn't actually acting like a normal human being. I felt a bit like a robot. And during this time, I experienced another bout of depression and I had trouble connecting with people. But there were some things I did practically to combat that, like I joined a Toastmasters club and learned how to give speeches, and that did help. But even then, there was something that was missing. There was something inside me that was wrong. Something that was giving me that deep depression. Or not that depression, that anxiety. And it's only within this last year that God finally revealed that to me. So, I went on a retreat about 4 or 5 months ago. And this retreat, it was a Christian retreat for one thing, and this retreat is, I think, the closest I've ever come to really, truly feeling God's presence, even more powerfully than at summer camp all those years ago. It was during this time that God made me realize that my priorities weren't straight. I wasn't focusing on what I was meant to focus on. I was preoccupied. I was selfish. And I think that that's part of what held me back. Whenever I went to any social situation, I always thought about myself, How am I acting? How am I talking? How am I doing in this situation? Am I putting on a good image? Do I need to change my image? But what I didn't think about is, what about the other person? What are they up to? What God revealed to me is that it's not about me. It's very rarely about me. It's about other people. In the Bible, we're given two primary commands. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. In all my life, I'd been only sort of doing the first one and barely doing the second one. And so God revealed my own selfishness. And then he became my guide. He made me realize, I don't need to worry about things. God will lead me wherever I'm needed. God has a plan, and as long as my heart is on the Lord, I don't need to worry about how I'm presenting myself, because I'll be exactly what God needs me to be in any given moment. So it's really within this last year that God's helped me to get past that social anxiety and really start to embrace his role in my life, in my future, just in tiny moments where maybe I feel a little push to do something. And then I do it, and, well, I don't always know that it was God, but I know that I was obedient. And as long as I'm working towards obedience, then I know that I'm doing well. So, overall, I don't think I've ever been through any massive struggles. I've never been through persecution. I've never gotten whipped or beaten or anything. I don't have some crazy salvation story about being in the midst of sin and, realizing God is real and redeeming me or anything like that. But I do think that through several major aspects of my own brain, in a rather surprising way, really, God has revealed himself to me, and he's worked repeatedly in my life to get me to where I am now. And I think that's really cool. It's incredible the way that God works, and when you look back, you just realize, man, God is amazing. So yeah, This testimony was meant to be 10 minutes, and we've just hit 20 minutes now. So that's cool. I'm going to have to dumb this down a bit, probably. Although, long testimonies, I don't think too many people complain about that. But yeah, that's my life. Thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed hearing my testimony. I hope maybe you resonated with some aspect of it, or if there's any experiences you want to share about your own life, either struggles with OCD, ADD, social anxiety disorder, or ways God's worked in your life, or really if you just want to share your whole testimony, honestly, I'd be willing to read it. You can do that in the comments or whatever. Yeah. Thanks for listening. And this is goodbye.